My name is Max Boykoff. I'm on faculty here at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I am a fellow of the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, which is a mouthful, but it's CERES. And I'm part of the Science Policy Center, which is under the umbrella of CERES. I teach in environmental studies and in geography as well. And so my research actually relates in those fields in terms of trying to understand how formal climate science and policy really find meaning in people's everyday lives. So how these formalized processes translate to people's attitudes, intentions, beliefs, and behaviors about climate change. I also look at how these then, as they're placed as priorities in the public view or not priorities, how that then feeds back on the processes of formal climate science in terms of funding, and then in terms of climate policy priorities and certain actions taken around climate change. So as part of this research, one of the things that I've been drawn to is the role of mass media and media representational practices. They really form a bridge between these formal spaces, these more insular and expert-led spaces, to those of everyday people. Very few of us have access to peer-reviewed literature, have access to a lot of the meetings that make big decisions about the way we live our lives, really the spectrum of possible action to take in the face of modern climate change. And mass media provide a real bridge so that people can understand what is the most recent scientific research, or how does a certain recent event, such as a flood, a hurricane, so forth and so on, relate back to the science around climate change. What sorts of ways are governments and other entities taking action to help the population grapple with these challenges, to enable people to protect themselves or be more resilient in the face of these global environmental changes. In terms of how mass media have been covering these issues in Colorado over the last 15 years, I can't say I've really got a good handle on that. I mean, this is my third year now here in Boulder. Before that, I'd been at the University of Oxford doing research, mainly focusing on European media, UK media, and their coverage, and how it actually, different representations of climate change influence different socioeconomic classes, looking at how working class people are engaging with these themes. I have been tracking and analyzing media coverage of climate change across the US since really the 1980s, when this moved into the public arena. There was a series of events that took place around 1988. There was a heat wave and drought here in the United States that sensitized people to this notion of climate change and to unprecedented human contributions to climate change. At that time, in the summer of 1988, James Hansen had testified to the US Senate. He's a NASA scientist, saying that climate change, global warming has begun. It's time to stop waffling about this and do something in DC and elsewhere. And so these are a couple of the events and issues that were raised. At that time, also scientifically, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this UN body, was formed to try and deal with and try and bridge from the scientific information into policy action on climate change. So this really moved into the public arena. A lot of the tracking and a lot of the monitoring and analysis that I've done around what actually makes for media coverage of climate change is really around four main points. First are political activities, such as Hansen speaking to the US Senate. Second could be scientific endeavors, such as new scientific information, a new study that may challenge, maybe orthodox thinking on something, or may actually just further help fortify our understanding of certain issues. The third are ecological and meteorological events. So disaster events, the heat wave and drought in 1988. Hurricane Katrina was a massive event that shaped climate coverage. Now, while there remain ongoing discussions and debate about the extent to which you can trace these events back to climate change, the fact that they enable these discussions around climate change are important. The fourth of these four is cultural events. So this is something that moved onto the scene much later, but something such as Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth certainly played a part around 2006 in shaping the climate discussion, really influencing what people saw as this spectrum of possible action to take on climate change. So as that's moved down through time, that's definitely changed in different ways. There was a certain period of time moving towards the end of 2009 When Barack Obama was new in the presidency, there was a great deal of hope and enthusiasm for concerted, substantive climate action at the international level, going into a meeting in Copenhagen, a United Nations meeting, set of climate talks. The conversation had shifted from less about the science itself to more about the politics going in. But then there was a trigger event. There was a hacking scandal out of the University of East Anglia that's been affectionately or denigratingly called ClimateGate, where emails from a group of scientists based primarily there at the University of East Anglia were released or into a public space. And so this then shifted a lot of the discourse back to the fundamentals of science. Over a period of time, there were a lot of fundamental scientific questions being asked about whether the climate's changing, whether humans really play a role, or if this was some sort of trick set up by the scientific community. This has again faded a bit, where actually a number of 5 independent investigations of these emails had found no wrongdoing, no manipulation. But this, in the meantime, in the public arena, through mass media, it really shifted a lot of discussions that were taking place. Now, with the rise of the U.S. Tea Party here in the United States, some of these resonant themes about questioning the fundamentals of science have reemerged. And so as we're moving into the primary season in the United States, the questions around the fundamentals of science are becoming more prominent again. That it's become a bit of climate correctness, a bit like political correctness, but climate correctness within the Republican right to question humans' role in climate change. And that's generated and perpetuated a lot of press within traditional media, television, newspapers, then also within new and social media across the blogosphere, through Twitter, Facebook, and these other ways of communicating. There was a really influential climate scientist who just passed away last year, Stephen Schneider, who was brilliant at being able to communicate the complexities of climate science to everyday people in just plain language, in ways that they could understand, through metaphors, through analogies, and other ways. And one of the things that came out of a lot of people's discussions from his passing is that now it is up to us. And I mean, that is really the crux, that the center of how we can do anything about it really boils down to us individually. We scale up to societal questions, to our neighborhood, to our families, starting friends, neighborhoods, community groups, cities, regions, states, so forth and so on. I mean, the challenge of climate change, in and of itself, is that it is really this global problem that demands long-term solutions, that requires many people committing themselves to being involved, and it requires a lot of resources across cultures, across political situations, and so forth. So in and of itself, it makes it the very kind of problem that's the most difficult to resolve. It's difficult to resolve individually. It's difficult to resolve just within one community or one political system. And that's part of the challenge. But it really is up to us to be making individual decisions. And so when mass media are presenting these stories in particular ways, it shapes the way that everyday people decide what are good decisions to make, whether to make any decision at all on this, or whether this is someone else's problem. There's a lot of work within environmental communication, within geography, within human geography, that's begun to look at, this isn't just an issue of giving people the right information and then they make the right choices, giving them enough information, just filling them up with all kinds of scientific knowledge, and they'll do the right thing. It's not like that at all. It's much more complex, that there are all kinds of influences that go into shaping what becomes particular action on climate change. It's very difficult, actually, to make the connection between, what we may hear on the radio in the morning and what we do for the rest of the day. And if we just think about ourselves, I know better than doing some things, but I still take a flight every now and again. And we have to just be mindful of the challenges that are involved, but yet it is up to us to be making decisions with this information available. But when it comes to, thinking more broadly about where do the U.S. public come down on this issue, there's some great work that's come out of Yale University and George Mason University. It's an ongoing study called Six Americas, and I'd certainly recommend that people look it up. Tony Lazarowitz and Ed Maybach have been studying what they call 6 different segments of the U.S. population. Some people who they call are very alarmed, those that think that we need to be taking urgent action immediately to address climate change as a priority issue. Then there are others who are considered concerned, who also see this as an important issue of our time, perhaps nested within a set of other ongoing challenges, such as socioeconomic inequality, or in other words, poverty, such as consumption, such as population, these kinds of issues. Then there's a large group of people within the U.S. public that are largely dismissive or ignore these issues. And this can make sense. Again, this is a long-term issue that requires a lot of resources across many different cultures and communities. There are more immediate things to worry about. Water quality, school lunches, one's own job, the health of the economy and how that helps people keep in their homes. So these issues can slide off the agenda for a large swath of people. And at the other extreme, perhaps, are those that are dismissive or really just deny the reality of the scientific evidence. So they've done a really good job to help segment and help us understand really the different approaches that can be useful in reaching out to those people and making these issues meaningful from where they are, from where they sit. I teach here at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm working with, I'm in the classroom with a number of bright undergraduate students. What strikes me nowadays, is that these students have been born into a world largely where this issue of climate change was already on the public agenda. This came into the public arena in the late 1980s, and many of these students were now born in the 90s, which is quite fascinating. But at the same time, a lot of these students that I've found have a much more sophisticated and mature and wise approach to these sorts of global challenges. So a lot of the questions that come up in terms of what can they do to make good decisions to help influence these processes can just boil down to trying to influence your local communities in terms of providing better transportation, better public transportation for them to get to the university, to get to other places in their everyday lives. Some of these challenges can be addressed through, the sorts of things that they choose to study and pursue after they're at university. And a lot of the long-term action is going to have to come at the policy level. There's a big bottleneck in terms of federal policy action on climate change. There are a lot of really inspiring and great things happening at the grassroots level. A lot of communities talking about decoupling their energy production from fossil fuel use. When we're turning on a light bulb in the classroom, or if you turn on a light bulb in your home, you don't know whether that comes from heavy polluting coal or from wind energy, from clean energy. And so a lot of the choices that are taking place at the municipal level can address that so that we can continue to maintain our quality of life, as it were, but generating it from renewable and alternative energy sources. So I think that one of the main things that young people can do is to commit themselves to, there's everyday activities that one can take in terms of, food choices that they make, but to think about the larger scale contributions that they can make, because it really is up to them. I mean, I think the fossils of science policy interactions on climate change are those that think, young people just need to remain respectful and we're going to take care of that. When, really it is the previous generations, through rapid industrialization, through energy production and fossil fuel use, carbon-based industry, our commitments to carbon-based industry and society, that got us into this challenge. And it's really, I think, young people that I'm encountering through my work that are very creative, that have great new ideas, that are those that are going to be changing our institutional makeup and our everyday functioning, that enables a set of broader individual choices down the line. I think in terms of the question about, what is the most powerful lever for change? A lot of people do talk about population. Many others talk about technology. And the answer, unfortunately, is as complicated as the challenge itself, that it takes a lot of these different ways to approach it. And it's very much embedded in our culture in terms of we have to change our own thinking about these issues as well and what's possible. So, population often is propped up as one of the chief concerns, but if we turn to consumption, I have 2 children, and that's the equivalent of having many hundreds of children in Bangladesh. And so to place on Bangladesh some of the scorn through population issues, I think, is very misplaced. It's a big mistake. At the same time, our consumption, with thinking about our consumption here in the United States being so high, we need to think about how we can rein that in terms of city planning, in terms of everyday food choices, in terms of how we get around from place to place, in terms of the demands that we place on our governments to be introducing ways to decarbonize energy systems. So, the complexity of it is that it is part cultural, part consumption, part population, part technology that's going to help alleviate some of the challenges that we're facing now. All of these things matter. To what extent they matter is what generates a lot of debate. And so I think over-reliance also on technology at the expense of overlooking the cultural shifts that need to take place is also a mistake. It gets me back to thinking a lot about the Shakespearean perspective, really, that all the world is a stage and that people have their entrances and their exits, that there are these different tools that are available to us. There are different actors that will try and push and promote different perspectives, different actions. At the same time, there'll be those who think that we should slow down our action on climate change. But this is all a stage, and the sample size here is one, so it is up to us taking action now. In some of the work that I've done, I've looked at the tone, really, of stories in the mass media on climate change over time. Some particular empirical work that I did in the UK and in Europe was looking at the presence of fear-based stories on climate change, and found a real prevalence of them in the UK press. Now, there are a lot of logical reasons for this. I mean, in one respect, many of the things that are attributed to climate change, some weather events, political challenges, are fear-inducing. I mean, it is sometimes a scary issue. And a second aspect here can be that through mass media, and oftentimes a news hook that is used is this notion of fear, to grab people's attention, to bring them into a story, and then talk about the issues as well. There's some really good, important work that was done out of the UK by Saffron O'Neill and Sophie Nicholson-Cole. They wrote a paper based on research that they had done with focus groups through images and texts on climate change. They wrote a paper that simply was called "Fear Won't Do It," because their main finding there was that now, while fear can raise awareness about people's behavior, it can also be alienating, it can be debilitating, and it actually can move people away from feeling empowered to take action. And so it is that fear that can logically move into and provide a hook for a lot of these stories that can then also become a barrier for action. There's another dimension to this fear, in that there is a powerful swath based primarily here in the United States of skeptics or contrarians who whip up fear about the implications of climate action. Now, that's another dimension of fear that can get people to think that, if we do take action on this, that it'll be to the detriment of addressing other more immediate and pressing problems, that it'll be to the detriment of the economy, that it'll be to the detriment of these broad conceptions of liberty and freedom. And this has been also very prevalent in mass media. And it has also had an influence on attitudes, on studies like that out of the Yale University Study 6 Americas, that out of work that I'm doing with Nielsen, AC Nielsen, that looks at concern for climate change across 51 countries. This has shown to have an influence on people's attitudes on climate change. But at its essence, fear is a massive piece of all of this. And so to keep those logical hooks in productive spaces is part of the challenge. So if you were to ask a number of people, what they think are productive spaces for climate action, you get a range of responses. I mean, tracking back to questions around whether technology will lead us out of this situation, whether cultural change will lead us out of this situation, really whether business as usual will be just fine for this situation. And, so with that in mind, the research that I've done has shown that through mass media, that a lot of the fear messaging can raise awareness but can alienate people to take action. And similarly, a lot of the naming and shaming, a lot of the finger pointing can raise awareness about some of the villains and the victims that are involved, back to some of these tropes, these narratives that feed through stories about climate change. But in terms of production productive action, that they can be detrimental. So less finger pointing at someone else and blaming them for the issues, and more taking it upon ourselves to feel personally responsible, to be good citizens, to be good role models for the sorts of daily behavior choices that we make. And that can scale up to community change, it can scale up to community cultures, it can scale up then to putting pressure on federal policy actors to take certain actions, to place priorities on climate action. Growth is often propped up as something that is synonymous with well-being. But as we've discovered through our research in geography, environmental studies, and other disciplines, that growth isn't always a good thing. Waistlines grow. Growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. These things are not necessarily positive attributes. Yet when we're talking about the economy, we often talk about how this continues to need to grow, this through the market mechanisms. That as it relates to climate change currently, when we're looking at growth through fossil fuel use, that this continues to contribute to climate change. That despite a lot of the international policy action on climate change, despite the Kyoto Protocol and the pronouncements made and the commitments therein, that we've continued to see the growth of fossil fuel emissions associated with energy production from coal, from oil, from natural gas. But what really needs to happen there is to decouple, continue to have growth, but decoupled from these fossil fuel sources as it relates to climate change. So moving towards renewable energy can be a big step towards achieving ongoing growth, achieving better well-being and community health, but then also moving away from these heavy polluting sorts of issues. And that then trickles into or permeates issues around public health, that local air quality can improve. Renewable technologies, if also addressing questions around labor power and labor issues, can help alleviate some of the socioeconomic massive differences, massive divides that we see in our society now. These can empower certain communities that have been left behind before. So we can continue to have growth while also addressing climate change, so long as we make some of the hard choices that get to the fundamental institutional and structural issues about how we generate energy, how we use and distribute energy in our society. When people ask, do we need to keep growing? I'd say it depends on who you're talking to, and it depends on what sort of growth you mean. In terms of community growth, better community cohesion, certainly we've got a lot of room for growing. If you're talking about, economic growth, economic progress, there are cases that can be made where this growth can be achieved through decarbonized practices, through renewable energy technologies. I think in terms of also invoking this, what should we do? We really need to unpack and distinguish between who we mean by we. Somebody who lives in rural Honduras without any access to irrigation, which is trying to grow beans in concert with the changing rainfall patterns, is a very different sort of we than somebody living in an urban space in Denver, Colorado. And so thinking about what works for each of these groups invokes a different set of responses to what kind of growth is needed. I'd say that the bulk of people in this world want to grow out of poverty, right? And so to then be placing any sorts of restrictions on growth in that respect is a violation of the human right to well-being. And so there are ways that we can more intelligently and more carefully be dealing with different aspects of growth, where this can continue certainly through time, but we just need to be much smarter about this. We need to smarten up the way that we're thinking about and discussing these possibilities. How to better communicate with people to understand the importance of this issue is one of the, consistent questions that gets discussed within the communities in which I'm involved with research and teaching. Many people have different ideas. Some folks have said, the time is now, action is urgently needed, and you've got people that have decided to have a sit-down protest on the steps of the White House to protest a large pipeline from Canada for oil, for energy production coming into the United States. You have others that say that, the approaches needed could be done through the political system, through generational change. But it's the sorts of ways that we can reframe this is really, I think, through the work that I've done, is to help people understand how this threads through their immediate concerns as they are right now, that their long-term health depends on short-term decision making. And so sure, the quality of water could be an issue in your immediate and everyday, but that can then be traced back to challenges that are related to larger global change problems and to climate change. And so in order to reframe these issues as a collective struggle, as well as something that then permeates all aspects of our life, I think is a positive step forward. I mean, there have been other actors that have stepped up, actors, so to speak. Mr. Al Gore has been talking recently about the time for action is now. We need to be confronting contrarians or foot draggers on this issue as we confronted racists in the 1960s. Now, a very bold statement. Al Gore has decided to take up a role that may, as he may see it, is then broadening this spectrum of possibility for others to step in and take more pragmatic approaches. But again, I think that in this theater where the world is a stage, it takes many different approaches, many different offerings, many different commitments and levels of commitment from all of us in order to be able to address this. The carbon offsets have basically come into existence because people want to reduce their pollution, but they don't necessarily want to do it directly, that they could pay somebody else to reduce emissions elsewhere. And then if you pay them to carry out that practice, you're effectively offsetting your own emissions at home by paying that person to do it. And there have been actually a number of projects that have been useful and good at achieving that exchange, because you could potentially pay somebody in rural Honduras again to be changing their farming activities and actually achieve the same level of emissions reductions for a much lower price than you would doing it here in Boulder, Colorado. So there are cases to be made, and there are a number of projects that have really done well to try and set up these systems of exchange to then empower communities that have been left behind through carbon-based industry and society in the past. But at the same time, because this is a new endeavor, because this is a new industry, that there are a lot of places where this can be abused, that many of the offset projects may not be followed through to their conclusion, such as, there was a pretty high-profile case where Chris Martin from Coldplay had said that one of his albums, A Rush of Blood to the Head, was going to be carbon neutral, and that they would then take all the money that was put forward in the production of this album and put it towards a mango plantation in India, in rural India. Well, that was great. They planted a number of trees, but as it turned out, they went back, a journalist from the Times of London went back and looked at what had happened to this mango plantation, and 99% of the mango trees had died because the money was put into the planting of the trees. They learned later that the soil was not the right composition for mango trees, and that the money wasn't put into maintenance. And so the long-term value of planting this forest and taking up carbon from the atmosphere was lost. And so these are some of the challenges. They could be sincere mistakes that were made, or there can also be abuse of the system. Part of the fun and important work that can come about through these challenges is collaborating with people in different fields to try and address climate communications. One of the things that I'm doing is I've partnered with a professor in the Department of Theater and Dance, Beth Osnes, to put together a course that we've called Inside the Greenhouse, where we all understand our own roles within the greenhouse and try and develop narrative structures, metaphors, analogies, and then short productions to describe how we're addressing these challenges today. So what we're going to be doing is bringing in two high-profile speakers during the course of the semester and treating it a bit like the old Inside the Actors studio, where people such as Al Gore, or Leonardo DiCaprio, or Robert Redford will sit down and talk about their commitments to environmental issues, what motivates them to take action, what role they see themselves in as a part of this. And then we're going to incorporate a lot of student work to put together perhaps hour-long productions that help us better understand our role inside the greenhouse. We're also going to couple this with with school visits within the Boulder community, so that students are interacting with younger people to understand what's important to them as well. So I'm excited about it.